The morning mist settled over the grounds of Kensington Palace like a soft blanket, covering the perfectly manicured lawns and ancient oak trees. James Sullivan stood at his post near the main entrance, his red uniform crisp and spotless, his tall bearskin hat perfectly positioned. To anyone passing by, he was just another royal guard, silent and stoic, a living statue protecting the royal family. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, James carried a weight that no one could see. He had been standing guard at various royal residences for nearly 5 years now. It was an honor, his mother had said when he first got the position. His father, who had served in the military himself, had been so proud. James remembered the way his dad's eyes had lit up when he told him the news. That memory felt like it belonged to a different lifetime now, to a different person entirely. The job required complete stillness, absolute silence. Hours would pass where James would stand without moving a muscle, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Tourists would come and try to make him laugh, taking photos, making silly faces, sometimes even poking him gently. Children would giggle and wave. James never reacted. That was the rule. A royal guard was meant to be invisible, present but not really there, a symbol rather than a person. Most days, James appreciated the silence. It gave him time to think, though lately his thoughts had become darker and harder to bear. 3 months ago, his father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack. James had been on duty when it happened. He got the phone call during his break, and after taking a moment to process the news, he had returned to his post and finished his shift. What else could he do? The royal family needed protection. Duty came first. His mother had struggled to understand why he had not come home immediately. She had needed him, she said through tears on the phone later that evening. But James had been raised to understand responsibility, to honor his commitments. His father would have understood. His father would have done the same thing. At least, that is what James told himself during the long, sleepless nights that followed. The grief sat in his chest like a stone. It made everything feel heavier, even breathing sometimes. But James had learned to compartmentalize, to push his feelings down deep where they would not show on his face. At work, he was the perfect guard. At home, alone in his small apartment, he would sit in silence, staring at old photographs of his father, wondering if he had made the right choice that day. His colleagues at the palace knew something had happened. They had heard about his father, offered brief condolences during shift changes, but they did not push. Everyone in the service understood that personal matters stayed personal. You dealt with your problems on your own time. On duty, you were focused, professional, unshakable. This particular morning felt especially difficult. It would have been his father's 65th birthday. James had woken up with that knowledge sitting heavy in his mind. He had gone through his morning routine on autopilot, putting on his uniform with the same mechanical precision he had practiced for years. But his hands had shaken slightly as he buttoned his jacket, and he had to take several deep breaths before leaving his apartment. Now, standing at his post, James focused on keeping his breathing steady, his expression neutral. The morning was quiet. A few early joggers passed by on the street beyond the palace gates. Birds sang in the trees. The world continued on, completely indifferent to the ache in his heart. He heard footsteps approaching from inside the palace grounds. James did not move his eyes to look. That was the discipline. You acknowledged visitors only when necessary, when protocol demanded it. The footsteps grew closer, lighter than the usual heavy boots of his fellow guards. They slowed as they neared his position. Through his peripheral vision, James could see a figure in a pale blue coat. He recognized her immediately, though he kept his gaze fixed forward. Princess Diana. She walked these grounds often, usually in the early morning when the palace was still quiet. She had a reputation among the guards for being different from the other royals. She would smile at them, sometimes even say hello. Some of the older guards found it unusual, this princess who insisted on acknowledging their existence. James had seen her many times during his years at the palace, but they had never directly interacted. He was just another guard to her, he assumed, one of many silent figures in red uniforms who blended into the background of her daily life. That was how it should be. That was the natural order of things. But this morning the footsteps stopped directly beside him. James felt his pulse quicken slightly, though his face remained perfectly still. Princess Diana stood there, not moving on as she usually did. In his peripheral vision, he could see her turn to look at him. Several seconds passed in silence. James wondered if something was wrong, if protocol required him to speak or move. But no, the rules were clear. Unless directly addressed, a guard remained still and silent. The morning air felt suddenly warmer. James could sense her eyes on him, studying his face with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. What was she seeing? Could she somehow read the grief he worked so hard to hide? Could she see past the uniform to the broken man underneath? The thought made his chest tighten with a panic he fought to suppress. He needed this job. He needed the structure, the routine, the distraction. He could not afford to fall apart, not here, not now. Diana had always noticed things that others missed. It was both a gift and a curse. This ability to see past the surfaces people presented to the world. She could sense pain in others like some people could sense a change in weather. And this morning, as she walked past the guard stationed near the entrance, she had felt it radiating from him like heat from a fire. She had walked these palace grounds countless times, often using the early morning hours to think, to escape the suffocating formality of royal life. The guards were a constant presence, so familiar that most people stopped really seeing them after a while. They became like furniture, part of the scenery. But Diana had never been able to do that. She saw them as people, individuals with their own lives, their own struggles. This particular guard was someone she had seen before, though she did not know his name. He was younger than many of the others, perhaps in his late 20s. Usually his face held the same carefully blank expression they all wore. But today something was different. There was a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his jaw that spoke of barely controlled emotion. Diana recognized it immediately, because she had seen it in her own mirror many times. She had learned about grief early in her own life. Her parents' divorce when she was young had left wounds that never fully healed. Later, trapped in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty on the inside, she had discovered new depths of loneliness. The palace walls that seemed so grand to outsiders often felt like a prison to her. She understood what it meant to smile for the cameras while breaking apart inside. So when Diana saw that same carefully maintained facade in this young guard's face, something in her heart recognized a kindred spirit. She slowed her walk, then stopped beside him. The guard did not move, did not acknowledge her presence. That was protocol. She knew the rules as well as anyone. But rules, Diana had learned, sometimes needed to be bent, especially when someone was hurting. She stood there quietly for a moment, studying his profile. He was doing an excellent job of maintaining his composure, she would give him that. His uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect. But Diana had spent years learning to read people, and she could see the small signs. The slight tremor in his hands that he was fighting to control. The way he was breathing just a bit too carefully, as if afraid that any deviation might cause everything to fall apart. Around them, the palace was beginning to wake up. She could hear voices in the distance, the sounds of staff beginning their daily routines. Soon this area would be busy with people, and the moment would be lost. Diana made a decision. She had learned long ago that life was too short to let opportunities for connection pass by. If this young man was suffering, and she believed he was, then perhaps a few kind words might help. At the very least, they could do no harm. She thought about her own struggles with the rigid formality of royal life. The countless rules about who could speak to whom, about what was proper and what was forbidden. There were people in the palace who believed that royals should maintain distance from the staff. That familiarity bred contempt. Diana had never agreed with that philosophy. She believed that every person deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged as human. It was this belief that had led her to visit hospitals and homeless shelters, to shake hands with AIDS patients when others refused to touch them, to hold crying children in war zones. She had been criticized for it, called too emotional, too involved, but Diana knew that connection was not a weakness. It was perhaps the most important thing humans could offer each other. She glanced around to make sure no one was watching. The last thing she wanted was to get this guard in trouble. She knew how strict the protocols were, how even a small deviation could result in discipline, but the grounds were still mostly empty. It was just the two of them in this quiet morning moment. Diana took a small breath and turned her full attention to the guard. She spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She did not want to startle him or put him in an uncomfortable position. Her words were gentle, chosen carefully. She had learned over the years that sometimes the simplest kindness could mean the most to someone who was hurting. The guard's reaction was subtle but immediate. She saw the way his breathing changed just slightly. The way his eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead, seemed to lose focus for a brief moment. He was hearing her, really hearing her, even though he could not respond. Diana felt a wave of compassion wash over her. How lonely it must be, she thought, to stand in silence with all that pain inside. She had no way of knowing exactly what he was going through. Perhaps it was a breakup or financial troubles or family problems. But the specifics did not matter. Pain was pain and loneliness was loneliness. Diana knew both intimately. She knew what it felt like to put on a brave face for the world while crumbling inside. She knew the weight of carrying grief alone. As she stood there beside him, Diana felt the familiar ache in her own heart. Her marriage was falling apart, though the public did not know the full extent of it yet. She felt trapped, misunderstood, desperately lonely despite being surrounded by people every day. There were nights when she cried herself to sleep, mornings when getting out of bed felt like an impossible task, but she kept going because people depended on her, because there was work to be done, because giving up was not an option. Maybe that was why she felt such a strong connection to this silent guard. They were both performing their duties while dealing with private pain. They were both putting on uniforms of different kinds, presenting carefully constructed versions of themselves to the world. In that moment, Diana felt less alone, and she hoped that somehow he might feel the same. The morning breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees. Somewhere a bird called out. Time seemed to slow down, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Diana remained standing beside the guard, her presence a silent offering of solidarity. She did not need him to respond. She just needed him to know that someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to stop. Someone had seen past the uniform to the human being underneath. Diana's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely louder than a whisper. She had positioned herself so that she stood slightly in front of the guard, close enough that he could hear her without straining, but at an angle that would not force direct eye contact. She understood that he could not break protocol, could not respond, and she wanted to make this as comfortable as possible for him. The words she chose were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine care. She told him that she had noticed him standing there, and that she could see he was carrying something heavy. Her tone was gentle, without pity. She did not want him to feel diminished or exposed. She simply wanted him to know that his pain had been acknowledged. Diana spoke about how difficult it could be to maintain composure when your heart was breaking. She mentioned that she understood what it meant to smile and perform duties while feeling shattered inside. Her words were personal, vulnerable. She was not speaking as a princess to a servant. She was speaking as one human being to another, both of them struggling with burdens that the world could not see. She told him that whatever he was going through, it was okay to hurt. That strength was not about never feeling pain, but about continuing to show up even when everything inside you wanted to fall apart. She said that she had great respect for anyone who could stand tall while carrying grief, because she knew how incredibly hard that was. For James, hearing these words was like having a dam break inside his chest. He had spent months building up walls, convincing himself that he was fine, that he could handle everything on his own. He had believed that showing emotion would be weakness, that a good soldier, a good son, should be able to carry on without complaint. But here was Princess Diana, one of the most famous women in the world, telling him that it was okay to be human. His eyes began to burn with tears he absolutely could not let fall. Not here, not on duty. But the effort of holding them back made his entire body tense. His hands, clasped behind his back, gripped each other so tightly that his knuckles went white. His jaw clenched. Every muscle in his body was working to maintain the facade of calm, while internally everything was crumbling. Diana continued speaking, her voice a steady, soothing presence in the chaos of his emotions. She talked about the importance of allowing yourself to grieve, to feel, to be authentic even in small private moments. She said that everyone needed someone who would see them, really see them, and acknowledge their struggle. She told him that he did not have to be alone in his pain. As she spoke, Diana reached into her pocket and pulled out a small handkerchief. It was white with delicate blue embroidery along the edges. Without making a show of it, without any grand gesture, she quietly placed it in the guard's hand where it rested behind his back. The movement was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who might be watching from a distance. The feel of the soft fabric in his palm nearly undid James completely. It was such a simple gesture, but it held an ocean of compassion. This woman, this princess, had seen his pain and responded with the kind of thoughtful kindness that people rarely showed to strangers. She was giving him something tangible, a physical reminder that this moment was real, that someone had cared. Diana then said something that would stay with James for the rest of his life. She told him that grief was not something to be ashamed of. That loving someone so much that their loss could break your heart was not a weakness. It was proof of the depth of your humanity. She said that his father, whoever he was, would be proud of him for continuing to show up, to do his duty, even while carrying such heavy sorrow. James felt something inside him crack open. How did she know? He had not said anything about his father. He had not mentioned the loss to anyone at the palace except in the most clinical terms when requesting time off for the funeral. Yet somehow this woman had looked at him and seen not just pain, but the specific shape of that pain. It felt impossible, and yet it was happening. Diana's final words were spoken even more softly than the rest. She told him that she would be thinking of him, sending him strength. She said that if he ever needed to talk to someone, there were resources available at the palace, people who could help. She knew that he could not respond, could not even nod his head in acknowledgement, but she hoped he was hearing her. She hoped her words were reaching the hurting part of him that needed them most. Then she paused. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. James could feel her presence beside him like a warm light in the darkness. His throat was tight with the effort of not crying. His vision blurred slightly as moisture gathered in his eyes. He blinked rapidly, fighting desperately to maintain control. Diana must have sensed his struggle because she said one more thing. Her voice was full of understanding and compassion. She told him that it was all right, that she knew he could not respond, that he did not need to. She just wanted him to know that he had been seen, that he mattered, that his pain was valid and recognized. Something in those final words broke through the last of James's defenses. For months he had been invisible in his grief. His mother was dealing with her own pain and could not see his. His colleagues were respectful but distant. His friends did not know how to help. He had felt utterly alone, as if his suffering existed in a parallel universe that no one else could access. But Diana had reached across that divide. She had seen him, and in being seen, in having his pain acknowledged so completely and compassionately, James felt something shift inside him. The tight knot of isolation that had been sitting in his chest for months began, ever so slightly, to loosen. He still could not speak. He still could not move. But inside, where it mattered most, something important had just happened. Someone had cared. Someone had noticed. And that changed everything. Diana prepared to leave. She had said what she needed to say, offered what comfort she could. She did not want to linger too long and risk drawing attention or getting the guard in trouble. But as she began to turn away, she heard something that made her freeze. It was the smallest sound, barely audible. A whisper so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind. The guard had spoken. James, fighting every instinct and rule drilled into him over years of service, had allowed two words to escape his lips. His voice was rough, strained from the effort of holding back tears. The words were cracked and broken, but they were real. They were honest. They came from the deepest part of his wounded heart. Thank you. Two simple words, but they carried the weight of months of unspoken pain. They held gratitude not just for Diana's kindness in that moment, but for the act of being seen, of being recognized as human rather than just a uniform. They were a release of pressure that had been building inside him for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Diana turned back immediately. Her eyes found his face, and what she saw there broke her heart. The guard was crying. Silent tears were streaming down his cheeks, running into the collar of his red uniform. His face was still directed forward, his posture still technically correct, but the tears betrayed everything. They spoke of a pain so deep that it could no longer be contained. James was mortified. He had broken protocol. He had spoken on duty. He was crying where anyone could see. Everything he had worked so hard to maintain had just shattered in an instant. But he could not stop. The dam had broken, and now that it had, there was no way to rebuild it. The tears kept coming, silent but unstoppable. Diana did not hesitate. In that moment, protocol meant nothing. Rules meant nothing. What mattered was this young man who was clearly in agony. She stepped closer to him, positioning herself between him and the main walkway, using her body to shield him from view should anyone else come along. She wanted to give him privacy, to protect him even as he was falling apart. She reached up, and with movements as gentle as a mother tending to a hurt child, she used her own sleeve to carefully wipe the tears from his face. The gesture was so tender, so completely unexpected, that it caused James to cry even harder. Here was Princess Diana, a member of the royal family, tending to him like he was someone who mattered, someone worthy of care. As she wiped away his tears, Diana spoke again. Her voice was thick with emotion now. She told him that she understood. She said that she knew what it felt like to carry grief alone, to put on a brave face while dying inside. She mentioned that sometimes the kindest thing someone could do was simply acknowledge that you were not okay, that you did not have to be okay. Then, in a voice that was barely holding together, James spoke again. This time he said more than 2 words. The story came tumbling out in broken whispers. He told her about his father, about the heart attack, about standing at his post when he got the call, about finishing his shift instead of going home, about the guilt that had been eating him alive ever since. He told her that today was his father's birthday, that every year since he was a child they had celebrated together. His father would make pancakes for breakfast, his favorite meal. They would spend the day together, just the 2 of them, talking and laughing. But this year his father was gone, and James was standing at his post doing his duty, when part of him wanted to scream, to break down, to admit that he was not strong enough to handle this. Diana listened to every word. Tears were now running down her own face. She made no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. She let them fall freely, a silent testament to the pain they were sharing in that moment. When James finished speaking, his voice giving out completely, she did something that would become legendary among those who later heard about it. Diana reached out and took his hand. Right there in full view of anyone who might be watching, she held the hand of a royal guard. It was a massive breach of protocol. It would cause gossip and probably disciplinary action, but Diana did not care. This young man needed human connection, and she was going to give it to him, consequences be damned. Her hand was warm in his. James could feel the softness of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers. It was the first human touch he had experienced in months that was not clinical or formal. It was connection, pure and simple, and it felt like coming home after a long journey through a dark and lonely wilderness. Diana told him that his father would understand, that any parent would be proud to know their son took his responsibilities so seriously, but she also told him that his father would want him to take care of himself, to allow himself to grieve, to be human. She said that honoring someone's memory was not about being perfect or never showing weakness. It was about carrying their love forward, and you could not do that if you were broken inside. She stayed with him for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. She held his hand and let him cry. She did not try to rush him or make him stop. She did not offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds or everything happening for a reason. She just stood there with him in his pain, bearing witness to his grief, letting him know through her presence that he was not alone. Eventually, James's tears began to slow. He took several shaky breaths, trying to regain some composure. Diana squeezed his hand one last time before letting go. She told him to take the rest of the day off, that she would personally speak to his commanding officer. She said that he needed time to properly honor his father's memory, not standing at attention but in whatever way felt right to him. James wanted to protest, to say that he could continue his shift, but the look in Diana's eyes stopped him. She was not making a suggestion. She was giving him permission to be human, and he was going to take it. Word of what had happened spread through the palace with the quiet efficiency that only palace staff could manage. By noon, nearly everyone who worked there had heard some version of the story. Princess Diana had stopped to comfort a grieving guard. She had wiped his tears with her own hands. She had held his hand in public. She had sent him home to properly mourn his father. Some of the older staff members clucked their tongues and muttered about protocol. They worried about what this meant for discipline, for the proper order of things. If guards started breaking down and crying on duty, where would it end? But even these voices were muted, uncertain, because the truth was that everyone who heard the story felt something shift inside them. Something important had happened that morning. something that transcended rules and protocols. The other guards spoke about it in hushed tones during their breaks. Many of them had their own stories of loss, their own hidden griefs. They stood at their posts day after day, maintaining their stoic facades, never allowing themselves to show weakness. But every single one of them had moments when it was almost too much to bear. Hearing what Princess Diana had done for James made them feel seen in a way they never had before. James himself had gone home in a daze. Diana had been true to her word, personally speaking to his commanding officer and ensuring there would be no disciplinary action. She had even arranged for him to have the next week off with full pay. When James learned about this later, he had broken down crying all over again, overwhelmed by her kindness. He spent that afternoon at his father's grave. He brought flowers and sat on the grass beside the headstone, talking to his dad the way they used to talk during their birthday breakfasts. He told him about what had happened, about Princess Diana's compassion, about finally allowing himself to truly feel the loss he had been running from for months. For the first time since his father's death, James allowed himself to really grieve. He cried without trying to stop the tears. He raged at the unfairness of losing his father so young. He laughed, remembering funny moments they had shared. He let himself feel everything he had been suppressing, and while it was painful, it was also healing. Like lancing a wound that had been festering, the release of emotion was necessary and ultimately beneficial. That evening, James called his mother. Their relationship had been strained since his father's death. She had been hurt that he had not come home immediately, and he had been too wrapped up in his own pain and guilt to properly address her hurt. But now, sitting in his apartment with Diana's handkerchief still in his pocket, James found the courage to be honest with her. He told her everything, about his guilt over finishing his shift, about how much he was struggling, about his fear that he had let both his parents down. His mother listened, and when he finished, she told him something that made him cry yet again. She said that his father had always been so proud of his sense of duty, but that he would have understood if James had come home, that there was no wrong choice in that moment, only an impossible situation. She told him that she loved him, that she had never stopped loving him, and that they would get through this together. They talked for over 2 hours, really talked in a way they had not been able to since the funeral. By the time they hung up, something had healed between them. They were still grieving, would probably always be grieving in some way, but they were no longer alone in it. Back at the palace, Diana had gone about her day with a heavy heart. The encounter with James had affected her deeply. It had reminded her of why she did the work she did, why she insisted on connecting with people despite criticism that she was too emotional or too involved. This was why, because everyone deserved to be seen, to be valued, to know that their pain mattered to someone. She thought about her own struggles, her own loneliness, the marriage that looked perfect in photographs but felt empty in reality, the constant scrutiny from the media and the public, the pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, to always maintain a flawless image. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to suffer in silence while the world watched. That evening, Diana wrote James a letter. She did not have to do this. She had already done more than anyone would have expected. But she felt compelled to reach out one more time, to offer continued support. In the letter, she told him that she would be thinking of him. She provided contact information for grief counselors and support groups. She encouraged him to be patient with himself, to allow healing to happen at its own pace. She ended the letter by telling him that what had happened between them that morning was not a moment of weakness, but one of tremendous courage. That allowing himself to be vulnerable, to accept help, to acknowledge his pain was one of the bravest things a person could do. She signed it simply Diana, not with any royal titles, just her name. When James received the letter a few days later, he read it over and over until he had memorized every word. He kept it in a drawer beside his bed, along with the handkerchief she had given him. They became treasured possessions, physical proof that his pain had mattered to someone, that he had been worthy of compassion from one of the most famous women in the world. Over the following weeks, James began the slow process of healing. He took Diana's advice and sought counseling. He joined a grief support group where he met others who understood what he was going through. He started having regular phone calls with his mother, rebuilding their relationship. He learned to forgive himself for the choices he had made, understanding that there was no perfect way to handle impossible situations. When he eventually returned to work, James was a different person. He still took his duties seriously, still maintained his professional demeanor, but he also allowed himself to be human. When he saw other guards struggling, he reached out quietly, offering support. He became known among his colleagues as someone who would listen without judgment, who understood that strength and vulnerability could coexist. He had learned this lesson from Princess Diana, and he would spend the rest of his life passing it on to others. Years passed, but the story of what happened that morning at Kensington Palace never faded. It became one of those tales that people in the palace service would share with newcomers, a reminder of what true compassion looked like. The story grew and changed slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same. Princess Diana had seen a guard in pain and had reached across the divide of rank and protocol to offer genuine human kindness. James Sullivan eventually left the palace service. Not because of what had happened, but because he discovered a new calling. He became a grief counselor, dedicating his life to helping others navigate loss. He often thought about how different his path might have been if not for Diana's intervention that morning. He might have continued to bury his pain, to deny his own humanity, until something inside him broke beyond repair. In his work as a counselor, James carried forward the lessons Diana had taught him. He treated every client with the same compassion she had shown him. He taught them that grief was not something to be ashamed of, that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. He became known for his ability to create safe spaces where people could be vulnerable, without fear of judgment. Many years later, when Diana herself passed away in that tragic accident in Paris, James was devastated. The world mourned the loss of the people's princess, the woman who had touched so many lives with her compassion and grace. James mourned too, but his grief was personal in a way that most people's was not. He had experienced firsthand the depth of her kindness, had felt the genuine care she had for others. He attended the public memorial, standing among thousands of others who had come to pay their respects. He brought flowers and placed them with the mountains of bouquets that covered the palace gates. Tucked among the flowers was a small handwritten note. In it, James thanked Diana for saving his life, because that was what she had done truly. She had saved him from drowning in his own grief, had shown him that it was possible to be both strong and vulnerable. In the years that followed Diana's death, James began sharing his story more openly. He did interviews for documentaries about her life and legacy. He spoke at conferences about grief and compassion. Every time he told the story, people were moved to tears. It was not just the story itself that touched them, but what it represented. In a world that often felt cold and disconnected, Diana had shown that genuine human connection was still possible. James kept Diana's handkerchief and letter in a special box. He would take them out sometimes, especially on difficult days, and remember that morning at the palace. He remembered her voice soft and full of understanding. He remembered the feel of her hand holding his. He remembered learning that it was okay to be human, to hurt, to need help. As he grew older, James made sure to pass down not just the story, but the lesson behind it. He taught his own children about compassion, about seeing people for who they really were beneath their roles and titles. He encouraged them to be brave enough to show kindness even when it broke the rules, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. The impact of that single moment of compassion rippled outward in ways Diana could never have imagined. Through James's work as a counselor, hundreds of people received the same gift of acknowledgement and understanding that he had received. Many of them went on to show similar kindness to others, creating an ever-expanding circle of compassion. Other palace workers who had heard the story were inspired to be more present with those around them, to look beyond the surface and see when someone was struggling. The culture at the palace shifted, slowly but noticeably, toward one that valued humanity alongside duty. People began checking in on each other more, offering support during difficult times, understanding that showing up for work did not mean pretending everything was fine. James often reflected on the profound gift Diana had given him. It was not just comfort in a moment of pain, though that alone would have been valuable. It was something deeper. She had given him permission to be fully human, to acknowledge his pain without shame, to ask for help without feeling weak. In doing so, she had freed him from a prison of his own making. He wondered sometimes what had prompted Diana to stop that morning. Had she sensed his pain through some intuition? Had she simply decided to check in on a guard who looked tired? He would never know for certain. But he liked to think that perhaps she had recognized a fellow sufferer, someone else who was carrying invisible burdens while the world watched. Diana's legacy was complex and multifaceted. She was remembered for her fashion, her charity work, her troubled marriage, her tragic death. But for James and those who knew his story, her greatest legacy was simpler and more profound. She had shown that every person mattered, that no one's pain was too small to deserve acknowledgement, that breaking the rules was sometimes necessary when human dignity was at stake. On what would have been Diana's 60th birthday, James held a special session at his practice. He invited anyone who had been touched by acts of unexpected kindness to come and share their stories. The room was packed. Person after person stood up and told tales of strangers who had helped them, of friends who had shown up in dark moments, of small acts of compassion that had changed the trajectory of their lives. When it was James's turn to speak, he shared his story one more time. He talked about standing at his post on his father's birthday, drowning in grief. He talked about the princess who had stopped and seen him, really seen him. He talked about the handkerchief, the letter, the permission to grieve. And he talked about how that single act of kindness had set him on a path that had allowed him to help countless others. As he spoke, there were tears in the room. But they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of hope, because every person there understood what James was really talking about. He was talking about the power of seeing each other, of acknowledging our shared humanity, of choosing connection over protocol. Years after that morning at Kensington Palace, James Sullivan could still close his eyes and remember every detail. The mist on the grass, the sound of Diana's footsteps, the softness of her voice, the warmth of her hand, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in months. It was a memory he treasured, not because it involved a famous person, but because it had taught him the most important lesson of his life. That in our darkest moments, when we feel most alone, sometimes all we need is for someone to stop, to see us, to remind us that we matter. Diana had done that for him, and for the rest of his life he would do the same for others. That was her legacy. That was her gift. And it would live on long after both of them were gone.